Final presentation of our update. I think everyone will be very happy to know that Cynthia Kleppinger is going to be presenting on investigator responsibilities. Although some of you may be apprehensive about the topic, I have no doubt that you will find this presentation thoroughly enjoyable. So I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia, who will spend the next hour talking about investigator responsibilities, including those applied during COVID-19, and then that will be followed by time for questions. So Cynthia, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I know it is late in the day for some of you, and I appreciate you taking the time to hear the final talk of this educational forum. Of course, a clinical investigator training course would not be complete without a discussion of the responsibilities of the clinical investigator. My learning objectives are listed. As this is a more advanced course, I'm going to summarize investigator obligations and focus on new information and some flexibility we've had in these emergent situations that I feel may be helpful to a more seasoned investigator. I remind new investigators that previous clinical investigator training courses have been recorded, are on our FDA website, and can be reviewed for more basic information previously discussed in those talks. It has been quite an experience since early 2020 for every one of us involved with clinical research. Luckily, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, as you have heard with some of the previous talks, FDA was already working on advancing potential efficiencies in clinical trials and had already engaged with external stakeholders on a number of topics dealing with decentralized clinical trials. I reach out to every one of you who pushed for innovation and who had such vision. Because the clinical trial enterprise, as we have known it, has changed since 2020, and we needed all that innovation. If you have heard my previous talks, you cannot say that I did not warn you as a clinical investigator to be prepared for a disaster. Of course, I did not expect what came to happen in 2020. I referred you to our FDA website to read about our coronavirus treatment acceleration program and the incredible work that has been done, all while FDA staff continued their other usual pressing work. Very interesting information there for you. So, amongst all this, are the clinical investigators. None of this could have been done without you at the helm of every single clinical trial. And what does FDA expect from you while you try to survive a pandemic? That you adhere to our regulations. Now for review, I always like to use this diagram to explain some of the confusion I see regarding compliance in clinical research. As the investigator, your first responsibility is to the study subject. Subject safety should always take precedent. If you have an investigational product and your study is regulated by the FDA, you have to follow our regulations under Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations. I often tell folks that these regulations are the minimum. You must follow the maximum for whatever regulation you are under. If you are also part of a federal agency, such as the National Institutes of Health, or receive federal funding or support, you must also follow the regulations in Title 45, Part 46, which includes 4 subparts. Subpart A you're probably most familiar with. It's often called the Common Rule. regulatory oversight is through the U.S. Office for Human Research Protection. We have tried to harmonize our FDA regulations with this office, and there has been a revised common rule that has attempted to move in that direction. I won't go into that now, but I want to alert you to the fact and to let you know that there are guidance materials out there if you're interested. Then you must follow all the policies of your institutional review board. I have been very surprised during some inspections when I asked the site investigator a question regarding safety reporting requirements for their IRB, and they have no idea. I hope you do. Then you must follow the policies of your institution. If you are working with an institution, there are often more institutional training requirements, requirements regarding contract language, requirements regarding retention of records, the need for additional oversight or involvement of a third party. Again, you need to make sure you get all the necessary training and you understand the policies of your institution. Then you must follow what the sponsor requires for their trial. I've often heard, where is that in the regulation? And do we have to follow the sponsor's request? Yes, if you sign the contract and it is not illegal or immoral, what they're asking you to do, you need to follow their requirements, which I can assure you are often more stringent than what we require in our FDA regulations. Again, here is the one guidance that I mentioned regarding the revised common rule, and again, I suggest you take a look at it. Now, in the United States, federal law takes precedent over state or institutional policy unless the state or local mandate is more stringent. For example, as many of you know, the legal age for consent to enroll in a clinical trial really depends on where the trial's taken place. Certain life events like military service, marriage, pregnancy, and childbirth may allow consent. A lot of medical practices use medical assistants. So I have a question here. What is your state's medical assistant's scope of practice, and who is authorized to delegate tasks to the medical assistant? Now, the answer depends on the applicable law of your state. Depending on which state you practice, some states, such as California, do have a scope of practice for the profession. Others have regulations and statutes on how providers and facilities may utilize medical assistants. Also, depending on the state that you practice in, there may be regulations as to who can delegate tasks to medical assistants. In some states, such as Texas, supervising physicians can delegate tasks to medical assistants through a licensed professional, such as a nurse practitioner. However, some states only allow physicians to delegate the task. So, although FDA does not require that a clinical investigator be a physician, and we have had physician assistants, nurse practitioners, dentists as clinical investigators, if you are one of these, before you delegate a task to a medical assistant in your practice, make sure that you are legally authorized to do so. Another item I want to bring up is a requirement if you work for a federal agency or receive federal funding. Now it is required that you get a certificate of confidentiality. Now, years ago, when I worked at the National Institute on Drug Abuse, we required these certificates for all our trials, as we had subjects who were often illicit drug users, involved with potentially illicit activities, etc. The certificate makes identifiable sensitive information in all copies immune from the legal process and cannot, without consent of the subject, be admissible as evidence or used for any purpose in any action, suit, or other judicial, legislative, or administrative proceeding. So in essence, our site investigators were not compelled to release such information to the police and other authorities. And you can understand when you have folks dealing with substance abuse problems, that they would be very hesitant if they thought what they told us would be passed on to the legal authorities. So now, any federally funded research project that involves the use or collection of identifiable sensitive information, and that again can be the research participant's name, you are required to have a certificate of confidentiality. Now, FDA has had the authority for the past 20 years to issue certificates of confidentiality. For non-federally funded research, we've been issuing discretionary certificates of confidentiality on a case-by-case basis upon application to the FDA. And I do also want to bring up that certificate of confidentiality protects subjects from compelled disclosure of identifying information, but it does not prevent the voluntary disclosure of identifying characteristics of research subjects. So researchers are not prevented from voluntarily disclosing certain information about research subjects, such as evidence of child abuse or subjects threatened violence to self or others. However, if a researcher intends to make such voluntary disclosures, the consent form should clearly indicate this. I also want to bring up that if an IRB in reviewing research determines that particular data collected in a clinical trial is sufficiently sensitive to warrant requesting a certificate of confidentiality, then it is within the purview of that IRB to request that a certificate of confidentiality be obtained in order to secure IRB approval. I have referenced here a great guidance if you want to read more information about this. Now, I have a question. If you have obtained a certificate of confidentiality for a study, do you also need Hipaa privacy authorization? And the answer is yes. As I mentioned earlier, the certificate may protect the identities of research participants from compulsory disclosure in certain legal proceedings. However, they do not prevent voluntary disclosure of research information, nor do they negate the fact that researchers collect private health information from participants and that many people may see that information, such as auditors, IRBs, inspectors from FDA, sponsors, etc. Now let's go on to the general clinical investigator responsibilities. We have our regulations, and as an investigator, you have to ensure that the investigation is conducted according to the signed investigator statement, what we call the Form 1572, that you follow the investigational plan, and you follow all applicable regulations. I refer you to an excellent guidance that I have told investigators about for years, but I would like to let you know that this guidance is on the list of documents being revised, so please keep your eye open regarding that. So, first commitment, personally conduct or supervise the investigation. I've repeatedly stressed, as have others at the FDA, that our regulations permit sponsors to transfer the responsibility to contract research organizations, but do not permit clinical investigators to transfer their general responsibilities to CROs or site management organizations, sub-investigators, or study staff. Also, I hope you're familiar with the ICH E6 guidance, because that too states that the investigator is responsible for supervising any individual that they delegate responsibility to. Also note that it says if you retain the services of any party to perform study tasks, you need to ensure that this party is qualified to perform those tasks, and you should implement procedures to ensure the integrity of those study tasks being performed and any data generated. So again, you cannot just delegate and turn your back and walk away. Now, another commitment is that you will follow the protocol. I cannot stress enough that if you are unsure about a section of the protocol, communicate with the sponsor your confusion. If you are confused, I can guarantee you that other investigators are confused. We are often asked about waivers for protocols. FDA regulations are silent on the issue, but it must be documented that a protocol waiver was given by the sponsor before the deviation. However, I want to remind you that protocol waivers are not allowed by many other foreign regulators and health authorities, and if you are inspected by them, you will be cited for protocol waivers. And there are many sponsors and institutions that will no longer allow them. So I would not advise that you request any, but again, they're not forbidden in our regulations. Another question, what is the number one deficiency that FDA inspectors find at an investigator's site? Not following the protocol. So again, please know the protocol. Now, another commitment is to make sure that your staff knows what they are supposed to do. You can do this a number of ways: delegating, talking about it, training. Again, contracts, make sure everything is written down. And again, standard operating procedures. Again, that is a commitment, and it is a lot of time committed to make sure that that happens. Now, another commitment, and it's pretty self-explanatory, that you let the subjects in the trial know that you're using an investigational product and that you get informed consent and institutional review board review and approval. Concerning consents, there has been a lot of interest regarding electronic informed consent, especially with the recent COVID-19 pandemic. This excellent guidance was prepared jointly by the Office for Human Research Protection and FDA. Now, electronic informed consent may be used to either supplement or replace paper-based informed consent in order to best address subjects' needs. But remember, some subjects may prefer one method over another. Other subjects may have difficulty navigating or using electronic systems. Again, they may have poor eyesight, impaired motor skills. In such cases, you really need to have the option to use a paper-based or some other method to either completely or partially inform them. If any or all of the consent processes take place remotely and it's not personally witnessed by study personnel, your electronic system must include a method to ensure that the person electronically signing the informed consent is the subject who is willing to participate in the research study or their legal authorized representatives. I also want to stress you as the investigator cannot delegate authority to obtain informed consent to the electronic system. So please remember that. Also, I want to let some of you, for those who are not aware, FDA has a COVID My Studies app. It's an option for obtaining electronic informed consent. FDA has made its COVID app available as a platform to facilitate secure electronic informed consent when face-to-face interactions are impractical due to COVID. It is available free through the Apple app or Google Play Store. So again, I have a website there if you want to read about that. Another commitment is to report adverse events to the sponsor. I like to point out that with this commitment, it says that you have read and understand the investigator's brochure. Again, you cannot fully be submitting these reports if you have not read that investigator's brochure. Also, please read the protocol regarding what the sponsor wants collected and the timeline. Some protocols require only adverse events of interest to be reported to the sponsor. Although most serious adverse events need to be reported within 24 hours, some protocols have death and other serious adverse events as an endpoint, and they will have other reporting processes and procedures. Again, you've got to be careful, read that protocol. This is hot off the press, and excellent guidance was just released regarding investigator responsibilities for safety reporting. I highly recommend that you read it. Another commitment is to maintain adequate and accurate records and to make them available for inspection. Now, I want to touch on the second part first. You need to allow us access to and to copy and verify your records. That's what the regulation says. We have had some sites where they did not want our inspectors copying their records. Again, the regulations say that you have to allow this. Now back to maintaining adequate and accurate records. You will see language for acceptable source data in the ICH E6 guidance. I want to point to you contemporaneous. That means originating, existing, or happening during the same period of time. We have seen records that were made days, weeks, months later. Again, that is not an adequate and accurate record. As many of you know, Part 11 outlines the regulatory requirements for electronic records. This is applicable for electronic records such as signed informed consent, source documentation, IRB records, drug accountability logs, delegation of authority logs, other records required by the FDA and kept at your site. So, for example, an e-regulatory binder system would apply to the situation because FDA-regulated records are stored electronically. If you have an electronic accounting system, on the other hand, and you collect your financial data, that would not be subject to Part 11. Now, if your site is using electronic signatures on any essential records, Part 11 signature requirements apply. Each electronic signature should be unique to one individual and should not be reused or reassigned to anyone else. There has been increasing use of electronic signatures during the pandemic. Remember, before you establish, assign, certify, or otherwise sanction an individual's electronic signature or any element of it, you must verify the identity of the individual. Some of you may ask, well, how do I do this? Well, FDA is not prescriptive regarding this, and there may be several ways to verify the identity of someone. You will need to establish a validated procedure and make sure that it is followed at all times. Also, I'd like to remind sponsor investigators that you have to submit a certificate of intent to use electronic signatures to the FDA when you're submitting applications. We've been asked, do we need to send a certification document to FDA every time we hire a new employee that will be using our e-signature system? And the answer is no. A single certification may be stated in broad terms that encompasses electronic signatures of all current and future employees. So just something for you to know. Now another question. What considerations apply to the electronic systems used to generate electronic signatures on clinical trial records, including informed consents, during the COVID-19 public health emergency? Or for that matter, I'd say any emergency. And the answer really is, when applicable, the electronic systems must comply with the requirements outlined in our regulations in 21 CFR Part 11, otherwise known as Part 11. When electronic system is Part 11 compliant, if it's not available, such as, again, during some disasters, you need to have alternative means of obtaining the acquired signature. So you could have a backup handwritten wet ink signatures executed on documents, or handwritten stylus or finger-drawn signatures executed on electronic documents that are then printed or appropriately witnessed. But again, you need to have some backup. If you have not read these guidance documents yet regarding electronic records and electronic signatures, I highly suggest you do so. Now, moving forward regarding more commitments. Again, you're to ensure the initial and continuing review by an IRB and let them know about all unanticipated problems that involve risk to subjects, and that you will not make any changes to the protocol without IRB approval unless it's necessary to eliminate immediate hazards, and also that you will comply with other requirements in our regulations. So what are those other requirements? Record keeping and retention. You've got to maintain adequate records of the disposition of the drug. We see a lot of problems with that during our inspections. You got to have accurate case histories that record all observations. You also need any other data pertinent to the investigation so that we can put together everything that happened at your site during the trial. Now another question. Here's an interesting one we received that incorporates the information just discussed. For an IND study, if a research study drug is ordered through a computerized medication ordering system, does Part 11 apply to the physician's electronic signature for the research medication order? And the answer is really no. These signatures are not normally signatures required under regulations, so Part 11 would not apply. Going on to other responsibilities, you have a number of reports you must pull together and send to the sponsor. Progress reports to the sponsor, and very important ones, safety reports. Those are your serious adverse event reports, as well as your adverse event, non-serious adverse event reports. I cannot stress enough having to understand safety reporting in the trials. You also need to send a final report to the sponsor shortly after your completion and participation in the study, and of course financial disclosure reports. Now you're sending that information to the sponsor so they can submit the information to us, either disclosure statements or certifications. What's important is that you keep the sponsor up to date on any changes during the course of the study and for 1 year following study completion. Again, there's a whole talk I could give on financial disclosure, and what I suggest, if you have not read this guidance document, that you read this document. Now, I cannot stress enough that data integrity along with subject safety is of utmost importance. So, as you are following the protocol, following the regulations, trying to stay compliant, what else should you be doing? Do real-time cleaning of the data. I cannot stress enough how important this is. I've seen investigators wait a year later before they start looking at the data. By then, patients have moved, some have died, staff has left, you have data that you have no idea what's going on, and you have nobody that you can ask the question to. So I cannot stress enough, constantly be looking at your data, seeing that it looks appropriate, get your queries out and answered. Also, pay attention that when the monitor shows up at your site or is looking remotely at your records and they have queries, respond to them promptly and close the loops. We need to know about all changes, whether it's on paper or electronic. So you need that audit trail so we can see clearly what changes were made, who made the changes, and why the change was made. Then step back, evaluate your need for system-wide corrections and trainings. Human errors happen, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. It just happens. But if you need to step back, was it just a one-time, or does the staff not understand something? Do you need more training? Is there more going on than just that one error? Because there will be more of the same down the road. So this is extremely important. Now, the trial has ended, and now you've got your records, and you've got to maintain them. Most of you know that the FDA regulations say 2 years after the product marketing application has been approved, or the sponsor decides they're not going to move forward, or the application has not been approved. So again, our minimum is 2 years. However, I always say to everybody, many other institutions require more. Your own institution may require more. IRBs, due to Hipaa requirements, often ask for 6 years. So it's very important you know all the requirements that you're under. And I advise you not to destroy any records until the sponsor of the trial gives you permission. You may want to check your contract with them because often the contract will say that. I also want to bring up that look at your contract because you may have to be retaining your records for a very long time. I've seen 10 years, I've seen 20 years before an marketing application was submitted to us. So does your contract include money for storage of those records? This is an excellent reference. It outlines our expectations for investigator responsibility, including delegation of study tasks, training, supervision of folks, and oversight of third parties. Again, if you have not read it, I highly advise that you do. As COVID-19 advanced throughout the United States and across the globe, FDA proactively released guidances in anticipation of operational challenges with trial conduct during the pandemic. FDA initially issued this guidance to sponsors, investigators, and IRBs. This came out March 18th, 2020. I'm just amazed how quickly staff was able to get this out. It provides general considerations to assure the safety of trial participants, how to maintain compliance with good clinical practice, ways to minimize risk to trial integrity during COVID. The guidance has been repeatedly updated as questions have come in and we've got more information. We're trying to be as flexible as possible and still protect subjects and the integrity of the data. So what does this guidance say? Well, if you're involved with a clinical trial and it's been affected by the pandemic, or for that matter, any disaster, so much that there needs to be urgent or emergent changes to the protocol and informed consent, please engage your IRB as soon as possible. But as you know, changes to the protocol are planned to minimize or eliminate immediate hazards or to protect the life and well-being of research participants. And that, again, could be to limit exposure to COVID-19 or other hazardous agents. That may be implemented without IRB approval or before filing an amendment to the IND, but are required to be reported afterwards. Our guidance says that there's alternative methods for safety assessments, and they could be implemented when necessary and feasible. The need to put new processes in place or to modify existing processes will vary by the protocol and local situations. It may not be appropriate to delay some assessments for ongoing trials, or if the study cannot be properly conducted under the existing protocol, a decision may need to be made to stop ongoing recruitment or even withdraw trial participants. So again, subject safety is paramount. I do want to point out that alternative methods to site visits for safety assessments have always been available, but really have not been fully embraced until the COVID-19 pandemic. So I just want to remind you that a phone call can be appropriate in many clinical trials for some visits and have been done in some protocols before the COVID-19 pandemic. This is pretty self-explanatory. Keep the subjects informed as to the changes in the protocol and in the monitoring plans that could impact them. Now, during this pandemic or another disaster, it is especially important that sponsor investigators consult with the appropriate review division if there needs to be protocol modifications for the collection of efficacy endpoints. That could be how they are captured, when they're captured, how often, etc. But please remember, the implementation of alternative processes should be consistent with the protocol to the extent possible. And sponsors and clinical investigators really need to document the reasons for any contingency measures that are implemented. So you should document how the restrictions led to the changes in study conduct and duration, indicate which trial participants were impacted and how those trial participants were impacted. Key changes we have seen during the pandemic include allowing electronic virtual consents, a reduction of on-site visit requirements, enabling home or local blood collection, and also modifications to treatment regimes to prevent more infrequent dosing of investigational agents when appropriate. Also, there's been infusional products which were part of the treatment regime and which were already approved, were in some cases administered at home rather than requiring clinic or hospital visits. Furthermore, I want to say at most sites, remote monitoring visits were encouraged to reduce the requirement for on-site access. But here's where I've seen some issues. Due to the pandemic, there were less on-site monitoring visits. So unfortunately, some sites inappropriately relied on the monitor to catch errors and keep the staff in compliance. Again, the monitors aren't hired by the investigators. They're not working for the sites. It's not their job to be catching mistakes and getting those corrected. That's your job as a clinical investigator. You should be having oversight of your staff. But without these monitors, these sites became one big mess. So again, the moral of the story is that, monitors are doing oversight for the sponsors. It's your responsibility to be checking your staff. Now, it's very important that we need to know about missing data. Again, we won't know about it if it's not documented that it's missing and why it's missing. So this information collected and then summarized in the clinical study report has been very helpful to the sponsors and also to FDA. So again, please document. Regarding investigational products, certain investigational products, such as those that are typically distributed for self-administration, may be amenable to alternative secure delivery methods. For other investigational products that are normally administered in the healthcare setting, sponsor investigators should consult and sponsors with the FDA Review Division on plans for alternative administration. Again, we're talking about home nursing, alternative sites by trained but non-study personnel giving the product. In all cases, existing regulatory requirements for maintaining investigational product accountability remain and should be addressed and documented. Now, I have another question for you. If a participant receives a vaccine or other medical product for the prevention or treatment of COVID-19 authorized under an emergency use authorization, EUA, would FDA consider this receipt of an investigational medical product? Answer is no. Now, let me explain here. As you probably know, certain clinical trial protocols have an exclusion criteria for receipt of another investigational product. When a medical product is being used under an EUA, it is authorized. Now, it may not be approved or cleared, but it's authorized for use in a clinical care setting, and therefore it meets the statutory criteria. The product is not being studied under an IND or IDE when used pursuant to an EUA. So, FDA does not consider receipt under an EUA of a product as receipt of an investigational product. But, there's always caveats. Depending on the design of the clinical investigation, there may be valid scientific reasons to have an exclusion and even a discontinuation criterion for a medical product under EUA, maybe a monoclonal antibody or a vaccine, for example. So keep that in mind. For discontinuation investigational product, FDA recognizes that some circumstances that may be necessary to discontinue the investigational product administered in a trial. Again, it could be lack of product supply during this disaster, inability to administer the product, cannot ensure the safe use of the investigational product, cannot get extended shelf life, etc. if there are individual trial participants to whom discontinuing the investigational product may present a substantial risk. We've stated in our guidance that the sponsor should consider amending the protocol after discussing with the relevant review division to limit the investigational product use to those patients with apparent benefit and discontinue the investigational product use to other participants. Again, in all cases, if a trial participant is discontinued from the investigational therapy, it's important that there be appropriate management after discontinuation. Now, during the COVID-19 emergency, a prepaid shipping package, and again, during this pandemic and others in the future, they can be used for the participant to return the investigational product back to a central location where it can be accounted for and disposed of per the protocol. But this approach is not the only one to satisfy our regulatory requirements. Regardless of the chosen disposition method, again, the sponsor and you as a clinical investigator must maintain adequate records regarding the disposition of the investigational product. As you know, there was COVID testing occurring, and some health departments required screening procedures. And folks had asked us that, did this need to be reported as an amendment? No. If it's a mandated healthcare system requirement, it did not need to be reported as an amendment to the protocol, even if done during clinical study visits. Now, the only time it would need to be if the sponsor was incorporating the data collected as part of a new research objective. Question: if an investigator receives an IND safety report from a sponsor, is it acceptable to review only reports that the sponsor indicates will result in a change to the investigator brochure, informed consent, or protocol? And the answer is no. You got to look at them all. In addition, we're requiring, again, per our regulations, that investigators report all anticipated problems involving risk to human subjects or others to their IRB. So FDA considers a serious and unexpected adverse event that meets the criteria for sponsor reporting to FDA and all investigators in an IND safety report to be an unanticipated problem involving risk to human subjects. Therefore, that must be reported to your IRB by you, the investigator. So, yes, there's a lot of IND safety reports sent. We expect you to take a look at all of them. Now, with the increasing use of central IRBs, many study protocols specify that the sponsor will submit IND safety reports to the IRB on the investigator's behalf. In these situations where you, the investigator, receives confirmation that the report has been sent to the IRB, now that may be that you're copied on the report sent to the IRB by the sponsor, we at FDA do not intend to object to the sponsor submitting the report to the IRB on the investigator's behalf, and would not expect you as the investigator to provide the IRB with a duplicate copy of the report. I want to just let you know that we have tons of information regarding COVID-19 on our FDA website in case you want to take a look. And for those of you who are brave enough to be a sponsor investigator, I always like to point out the resources available on our website. Of course, as a sponsor investigator, you have to follow the sponsor regulations, which include selecting qualified investigators, providing them with information needed, ensuring proper monitoring, ensuring that the investigation is conducted according to the general investigational plan, maintaining an effective IND, ensuring that FDA and all participating investigators are promptly informed of significant new adverse effects or risks, amongst many others, including providing the investigational product, providing study supplies, etc. Now, As a sponsor investigator, I want to focus on the fact that you are responsible for monitoring your own study. And again, we've seen problems and issues with this. Our one guidance document states that FDA recommends that sponsor investigators submit a brief summary to the IND to demonstrate that there is adequate monitoring of the clinical investigation. So again, we have issued guidance documents regarding risk-based monitoring. You can take a look at this. We know that sponsors use a variety of approaches to fulfill their responsibilities, but it needs to be done, and it is your responsibility as a sponsor investigator. I'm sure all of you are aware of Clinicaltrials.gov. Again, the intent of the legislation requiring that applicable clinical studies be registered is to ensure that the public has access to this information and that this information is reported. Again, it's usually a sponsor doing this, but they can designate a principal investigator. If you're to be designated, you have to be responsible for conducting the trial, have access and control over the data, have the right to publish the results, and have the ability to meet all of the requirements for the submission of clinical trial information. For a sponsor investigator filing an IND, for most of you, the institution with the regulatory oversight for the conduct of the study is probably already a registered research entity with a registration account. Therefore, as a sponsor investigator, you will not need to create a separate registration account. Again, we have excellent guidance documents explaining all this. And I'd like to bring up that we do have monetary penalties if these regulations are not followed. We just put out our first non-compliance letter to an investigator. When you have time, you can get on the website and read it. We also have sent two to sponsors, and many are coming. I also want to bring up this excellent website if you're a sponsor investigator, and we'll be submitting your first IND. Nice guidance document, again, for sponsor investigators submitting INDs. I'd also like to give a heads up that electronic submissions of standardized study data have been required since May of 2017 for new drug applications, abbreviated new drug applications, certain biologics license applications, and since May 2018 for certain investigational new drug applications. We have exempted these submissions regarding non-commercial INDs, otherwise known as research INDs, but it's something, if you're a sponsor investigator, to read and potentially address, as it may be a future requirement, but right now it is not. Also, we have a draft guidance out regarding electronic submissions of IND safety reports. Again, it is not a requirement until 2 years after the guidance has been finalized. The FDA will be letting folks know when you can do voluntary submissions to FAERS. Now, I'd like to bring up a little bit about preparing for an inspection. And if you are involved in FDA regulated research, there's a good chance you're eventually going to be inspected. So most of the time the trial has long ended. There's a good chance that you've moved the study files into storage. Please make sure you're aware of where your files are and can access them immediately. If it has been several years, it's good to refresh yourself with the protocol and other study documents. You will be asked questions, and the FDA inspector will feel much more comfortable if you are well versed on the protocol and everything that happened at your site during the study. If possible, make sure the study coordinator, sub-investigator, and other staff who were involved with the trial are available. They too will be asked questions, so make sure that they've refreshed their memory. The FDA inspector will want to meet you. They understand you're very busy. We'll try to keep communications to minimum. It is especially important to be available at the end of the day. The FDA inspector should be able to give you an update on how the inspection is going and may have some questions that need more explanation from you. The FDA inspector will need copies of some of your documents. If your documents are paper-based, the FDA inspector will need a copier to make copies. If you have electronic records, the FDA inspector may request electronic copies, often via a USB stick. If there is an issue, such as a missing file, it's imperative that you try to find it before the end of the inspection. Sometimes for regulatory files, you can get another copy from your IRB or the sponsor. You will not be cited if you can make corrections before the inspection ends. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has led to a dramatic increase in health services being conducted by telephone or video. While virtual or telehealth services may have many important benefits to patients, such as increased convenience, reduced waits, they may also pose challenges for those with low health literacy. So I say it's very important that you know your patients, that you really know your patients. For some new studies, there's been increased adaptation of digital health technologies such as remote pulse, blood pressure, ECG, and pulse oximetry, as well as collection of patient-reported outcome data. As these changes have become acceptable, been shown to be feasible across different sites and in multiple countries around the world, it's now very reasonable to ask which of these modifications can stay as part of the new normal way of running trials. So it's really important that you step back and reevaluate your electronic systems, see where you may have some potential flaws or security issues, and make sure your staff is trained on them all. Be prepared for telehealth, remote monitoring, and other decentralized processes. Thus, it is incumbent upon you as the investigator to envision continuing improvements to your clinical trial program. Again, be proactive, not reactive. Now we have our challenge questions. Number 1, which is not a responsibility of a clinical investigator? A, supervising individuals to whom the investigator delegates study tasks. B, informing patients that the drugs are being used for investigational purposes. C, ensuring initial and continuing review by an IRB. D, registering and reporting results of applicable clinical trials to clinicaltrials.gov. Again, which is not a responsibility? And the answer is D. Challenge question number 2. Which of the following statements is not true? Investigators are required to report to the sponsor serious and unexpected adverse events. Investigators are required to report all unanticipated problems involving risk to human subjects or others to the IRB. FDA regulations permit sponsors to transfer their responsibilities to contract research organizations, but do not permit clinical investigators to transfer their general responsibilities. D, an investigator must permit FDA to have access to and copy and verify any records or reports made by the investigator. E, a sponsor investigator is responsible for monitoring their own study. Which is not true. And it's A. Again, you must report serious adverse events, whether they're expected or unexpected. So, in summary, again, clinical investigators play a critical role in ensuring high-quality data. All regulations and responsibilities of an investigator must be followed. You and your staff need to know them. FDA is available and has many resources to assist you if questions arise. Establish at your site a culture that supports critical thinking and open dialogue. Let your staff know, hey, if you're seeing something wrong, if there's something you don't understand, they can come to you. Again, be open. At stake is public confidence and participation in clinical trials and ultimately the availability of safe and effective products. I love this quote. Again, there's always something to learn. Now, some folks have asked, would it be possible to share guidance documents that are expected to be issued shortly? We've been asked that in the past. And yes, they are publicly posted. I've listed here a few examples. Here are also some FDA sites of interest that I think are very good. And if you have not gone to these sites, I suggest you do. I really stress signing up for updates. Nobody can keep up on everything that's happening. I tell folks that even I've signed up for our own updates. So I suggest you especially go to that site. I always like folks to know that we have an office where you can send questions. So if you have any questions regarding good clinical practice, send those in. They're also kept, they're put anonymized up on our website. So you can even look at past questions and answers. Very, very helpful. Also good training tools. Here's some guidances of interest. Again, I hope you all read these. We also have some journal information sheets that I think are very good, especially for folks that are new to clinical research. And this is my 19-month-old granddaughter, Eleanor. I thank you very much, all of you, for your time and attention.
Well, thank you very much, Cynthia, for, as always, a terrific talk, a wonderful review. I see you have a league of followers, and there are a boatload of questions waiting for you in the question box. So if that's okay with you, I'm going to turn it over to you entirely, and you can try and get through as many of the questions as you can within the next 20 minutes. Thanks.
Okay, fine. Just want to triple check, Leonard. Can you hear me?
Absolutely, loud and clear.
Great, fantastic. Well, again, for those of you who have stayed through the afternoon, thank you. I hope you learned something. And I have the time. I'm willing to answer as many questions as we can get through here. So I'll start with the first one. Again, I had mentioned about these IND safety reports, and someone mentioned that they've received upward of 8,000 on a single trial. Do they really need to go through all those, and what can FDA do to decrease the burden on site investigators? And I will say this is a problem. You can imagine, as I've been a reviewer in the vaccine division years ago, and we're getting those too. And we had elective hysterectomies sent in, which is definitely would not be a routine IND safety report. So yes, it is a problem, but it is a problem of the sponsor. They should know what needs to be sent in. So and updating their investigators brochures appropriately. So we did put out a recent guidance. I had mentioned that we have a guidance on investigator, safety responsibilities, and we have a separate guidance now for sponsors. And so I do behoove all the sponsors to really do a lot of work on this because it is a great burden to the site investigators. Now, that being the case, again, you don't know until you read it if it's something you need to know. So I think, we do allow delegation of responsibility. So if you have a staff person who you think could make the first cut, and take a look at these reports and then let the ones of importance. I'm really big on communication. Hopefully, you've got a communication channel with the sponsor, and some sponsors do weekly or monthly meetings with all investigators, and I say bring it up. Because this is a burden, and I agree, and I think it is something we all need to discuss, and to have only the truly needed and accurate IND safety reports sent in to FDA and the site. So I wish I could offer more regarding that, but it really is a sponsor responsibility to only be submitting those that are appropriate. So next question. And I'm glad someone brought this up, that didn't we just announce the phasing out of the electronic informed consent app? And yes, unfortunately, my slides were due before that announcement occurred, and that's why it's really important to constantly be going up to the website and checking. But due to some funding issues, it was announced the end of November that we will be phasing out the COVID My Studies app. Now, again, that had replaced the FDA My Studies app. So this will be September of 2022 that it will be phased out. So for those of you who are using the app, you should really have received some sort of communication regarding that of alternative ways to deal with your informed consent procedures. So we have some information up on our website, and they're going back to the FDA My Studies app now. And if you have any questions regarding this, we do have the CDER Real World Evidence Program, and they have an email address, and contact them to discuss that further. But yes, that will be phased out by September of 2022. So another one is someone wanted just some more information about protocol waivers, provide applicable references. Again, it's not in our regulations. So as I mentioned before, if it's not mentioned, sponsors have the option. So there have been some, I think, European Medicines Agency's guidance documents about no waivers. Also, I know the NIH, NCI had a policy even years ago when I was at the NIH where they specifically stated that we will not do any protocol waivers. And unfortunately, I think some of it was the sponsors were calling various people in the program to get an approval. And so where you're going to see it is the sponsor themselves will let you know, your institution will let you know, your funding institution will let you know or should let you know. If you have any questions, be sure to ask them. But I think the big thing is that it is brought up, and it's personally, as one who was a medical monitoring studies, if you have a hard time enrolling subjects and the cutoff for a hemoglobin is 12 and you got a patient with an 11.5, you can easily see maybe giving a waiver for that. But, some people were really, I think for some of the institutions, they've taken advantage of that, and you really want consistency in who's being included in studies. Now, what I always say, too, is I think anyone running a study has to step back and say, if people are asking for a lot of waivers, maybe our inclusion-exclusion criteria are just too stringent. So I think that's the big thing, is stepping back and really looking at those and amending possibly the protocol, again, with your IRB approval and sending it to FDA. So, again, there's nothing in our regulations that state we do not allow those. So I always like to bring that up because it's often a question. So next question is information. Let's see. Again, there's information on the delegation log, and I think this is a big question we get. So you've got hospital employees performing protocol-related procedures, but they're part of the routine practice, ECGs, X-rays, etc. And that delegation log may be extensive. Now, what we've said, so let's say you have a group of nurses, and we have said that put the supervisory nurse's name, because you know there may be 30 people under that person. So put that because in a way they're overseeing them and they're ultimately responsible for them. So instead of listing that whole all those names, put the supervisory nurse's name. So if they're doing again protocol related procedures. Let's see, does access to records include audit trails? And again, someone said that they're not being able to look at the audit trails sometimes. And I say yes. Access to records includes the audit trail. So number one, if we at the FDA are going in to inspect your site, boy, you better have those audit trails and you better have them available for us to look at. If you have a sponsor that is monitoring your trial, boy, they should be able to look at those audit trails. Now, there's a number of reasons for looking at these audit trails. Again, we can see who really entered that information and when they really entered it. So this is a really important oversight function. And so, yes, those audit trails need to be available. So someone said, where can we find common 483s regarding investigator responsibilities? Well, we do have them up on our website under FDA. I think maybe we sent something afterwards after this training, the exact link. So where you can actually see the most common 483 findings. Now, there are actually redacted 483s up on our website. There are sometimes very interesting inspections that have taken place, and people have requested through FOIA the information, and so they've actually been uploaded onto the website too. So they are up there, and like I mentioned, the most common is not following the protocol. So I'd say if there's anything as an investigator, if you want to really try to avoid a 483, and for those again who may not know, again, FDA, when our inspectors go out and do an inspection, before they leave your site, they're going to at the end let you know as a whole, was everything okay that they saw, or were there some deviations from our regulations. I want to let folks know that they will give you that information right there, because I think we're the only regulatory agency that does that, and I believe the thinking years ago was that if it's that important to write it down, we want you to know immediately so you can fix the problem. Now, just 483 doesn't necessarily mean you've been running that trial horrendously. So things happen. Human error happens, mistakes get made. There may be some findings. We're extremely concerned if there's a lot of them. We're concerned, of course, if there's any fraud that's involved or anything that looks like it's been falsified. But, there may be that you miss some adverse events that our investigator happened to find when they were reviewing your file. So as I mentioned to you in my talk, again, if you've got a document, and I've seen that happen where there's an IRB approval document missing from the regulatory files, again, if you can get another copy of that and show us before we leave your site, then you won't be cited, for that. So try to work with the investigator, answer their questions, correct anything that is correctable there, and you can avoid a 483 observation. We also highly recommend, although it's not required, that you send a written response in 15 days, because again, what we want is for you to fix what we found. So if you can show that you recognize the observation, and here's what you've done so that it doesn't happen again in any of your future trials. So that would be showing training you've done with your staff. And it's not just saying I trained my staff, it's actually showing us what training you did. If you've written a standard operating procedure so that, again, that observation won't happen again, that's what we want to see. And we will review your response, and hopefully you won't be getting what we call a warning letter, which is our administrative action that a lot of folks want to avoid. Because, again, we're very transparent at the FDA, and those sort of things go up on our website. So, like I said, we have some common 43 findings, and they're up on the website. So maybe afterwards we can give you that. So someone commented on the remote regulatory assessments to compare and contrast them with our site inspections that were initiated during COVID, and has our site selection. We have actually a tool, a clinical investigator site selection tool, been updated recently. I'll just back this up a little bit. So, when we go out on inspections, we go to sites normally before COVID, and it will be our Office of Regulatory Affairs. They will be our inspectors, and I'm at headquarters. So sometimes we will go along if it's, a site with a large amount of subject files, or if there's a potential problem we may see, or if it's an extremely important trial. So we'll go out. So what has happened, as you know, is COVID happened. So the sites themselves did not want people showing up, because before vaccines, folks were definitely afraid of any sort of contact with anybody. And we, at FDA, as well as a lot of the other government agencies, wanted to protect our staff. So we very quickly shifted to remote regulatory assessments, and our staff would remotely have virtual contact with the inspected entity, a site or a sponsor, etc. And they had process and procedures they developed, and they had a secure network folder that they would ask the inspected entity to upload certain documents that our inspectors would then download and review. So it definitely was something. And we felt it was better than nothing. Many of us still did not feel it was the same as being on the site. So we did not call them inspections, and they had not been considered that. So some folks have said, well, are you going to go and inspect that site once you're able to do site inspections again? And we said maybe, maybe not. It depends on what they found. So most of them we haven't been doing. You may know that we are now doing on-site inspections again. Sometimes we're doing a little bit of a hybrid model in order to keep the contact to a minimum, and we may ask the site to send some documents ahead of time. There may be some virtual conference calls, etc., but we are doing those for domestic inspections. We're also doing some foreign inspections again, not nearly what we used to, and only to certain countries. So our clinical investigator site selection tool, we've updated it with a number of factors, but again, we did include red zones. There's a lot of factors that go into choosing a site for inspection. So, again, we don't want to put our staff in harm's way. And so if there was a site in a location where the transmission of the coronavirus was really large, then that site probably was not chosen to be inspected. So anyway, so a friend from Moscow has sent a comment, and yes, I do remember you very, very well, and I speak to our fellow colleague Dave, you know who I'm talking about. So anyway, nice to hear from you. And the question is, in case if an investigator delegates some obligation to a site management organization, should the IRB approve that and review the suitability of a site management organization facility? Well, again, it kind of depends. For those of you who don't know, this is they're being developed a lot here in the United States, and they're basically folks that own a research site, and they will hire basically physicians to be investigators for trials. And what we always tell folks is that investigator is still responsible for that trial. So what we have seen is that the site management organization will hire the study coordinator, and maybe the study coordinator isn't the best. Unfortunately, if something happens and she doesn't submit data she was supposed to up in the case report form or whatever, that investigator, even though they're a hired entity of that site management organization, they're the ones that are going to be getting the 43, and they're going to be getting in trouble. Now, a lot of the local institution review boards, again, they have that obligation to make sure that that investigator has the qualifications and training to run that trial. And there may be institution review boards that do want to look at that site management organization, and I can easily see them wanting to do that, but not a lot of them do, just from what I know. But I definitely see no problem with that at all, but it's not a requirement. Under what condition? Next question is, under what conditions are sites issued I think it's a 43 because of COVID? Well, we've been very understanding. I just want folks to know we've been extremely understanding regarding this COVID pandemic. So I don't want folks to worry if something has happened because of the pandemic. Again, we're interested in subject safety and documentation. So whatever's happening at your site or did happen, documented. Don't be afraid that if there's data that's missed, that's going on a 43, because again, we understand, we're in the middle of this pandemic and things happen. You do the best you can and you document. And if you can show us documentation of attempts that you've made, let's say you can't, get a hold of the subject or something else has happened. That's what we're looking for, that you tried to follow the regulations as best as you could during this pandemic. So anyway, when the study's completed, what happens to those clinical trial documents when sponsors have been acquired or merged with a different company and the documents are still stored with the investigator? The initial sponsor no longer exists or can't be contacted. But the bottom line is, you as a site investigator, you're responsible for your files. I mean, that's the first thing. So you have to make sure that I mentioned before about a contract, that you got a contract of how long you're supposed to keep them. Again, when you're told that you can destroy them. Again, a lot of sponsors now are saying don't destroy them until you hear from us. Just remember that they're your files. So if a sponsor merges with another sponsor, they should be having some sort of contractual agreement with you if you're part of that study, and they're going to potentially submit the data from that study to the FDA. So in all honesty, what those sponsors are doing, it's up to them regarding that contract, but you just be careful about your files. That's your, it should be your main focus. And I would say don't give original files. There's some companies that, maybe are out there and don't really know research that well. Again, those are your files. If they want to copy, fine, but very rarely should those files be, after the study's finished, sent to a sponsor. We have had some cases where an investigator died. Again, someone's got to store those files. So in those limited circumstances, it will often go to the sponsor. Now, what they'll do to, again, make us feel better is they'll have a third party, maybe a contract research organization or something actually holding that site investigator's file, because we want a pure chain of command at all times that you can show us where those files went. But most times they're just to stay at your site, or some of the investigators, if you're holding them for a long time, they will contract with a storage facility like Iron Mountain. Again, it's got to be secured. It's got to be sure about that. Now, next question, could you comment on whether assessments missed during a remote visit can be reported as a single deviation? Could you also comment on what criteria to use to include a protocol deviation in the clinical study report? Well, I'll answer the second one first. Again, there's no real good definition in the FDA regulations regarding protocol deviation. So there are some guidance documents, ICH, et cetera, with some definitions. Again, the person who's running that trial, the sponsor, needs to come up with the criteria of what's going to be collected. Some people mention minor, major, protocol deviations. Again, we don't have a regulatory definition of that, but you need to come up, again, before the trial starts, of what's considered an important protocol deviation and what you're going to be reporting in your clinical study report. And then when that clinical study report comes in, that should be explained of what is collected. Now, I would say keep everything, because sometimes we have asked, well, gee, you've sent in these, but we also want to see those. So anyway, but again, a lot of criteria is the sponsor and sending us the definitions and what they want to include in the clinical study report. So, because as we know, many of you know, especially you can imagine trial with 60,000 patients going for 10 years, being dumped. I hate to say it, but every protocol deviation, you lose the important information. So then, if the part of the first part of the question is, can you lump like assessments missed during a remote visit? Well, again, it all kind of depends, but if it's a bunch of laboratory work, yeah, you can lump it as missed lab. You don't have to go to every individual one. So again, I would say if in doubt, first of all, go to the sponsor that you want to see with that, and then your institutional review board, because again, you're supposed to be many of them want your protocol deviations sent to them. So if you have any doubt, I would go to them and see what they want you to do. So next question is, prior to approval, vaccine candidates were offered under EUH. Yeah, this is what so mentioned as investigational. Okay, and yes, we have it in our own material. So folks were basically questioning when I had mentioned about the EUA vaccine, that it won't be part of inclusion-exclusion criteria as investigational products. So, okay, we're near that time. Okay, I just want to let you know. So I would say, yes, you're right in what's that, but remember, an EUA product is one step above something that hasn't gotten that approval. And all I'm saying is that in our guidance documents, that is what we're saying. So again, we want to move research ahead. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We want everyone to get a COVID vaccine. So here we had all these vaccines under EUAs. Nobody could be in trials. I mean, think about that. So definitely we have said that, yes, if there's a protocol with an exclusion criteria for an investigational product, that those folks don't need to be excluded. So someone said here we're initially out of time. I can take as long as I need and then pass it on. So I'll do maybe one or two others here. So next question for sponsor investigator studies. Someone receives external safety reports from manufacturers that mention that the event is expected and related to the study agent. Does the sponsor investigator need to review these if they are expected? Well, how do you know unless you're reviewing them? That's what I'm saying. So I would say I would err on safety. Again, delegate it to somebody. If you're getting them, they can do the first cut. And if there's something that maybe you didn't know about, maybe it is unexpected, then yeah, you should be looking at it. So next question, under what conditions are sponsor investigators issued 483s? Well, the same condition as an investigator, the same conditions as a sponsor. I mean, we go out and we do inspections of sponsor investigators. We have done those, and they've gotten 483s. They will get observations if there's been an issue as an investigator, and they will get observations if there's been an issue as a sponsor. And right now, I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to pass this back to Leonard. I appreciate all of you for all these questions. I know there's some more I was unable to get to. So thank you so much, and I'll pass this all back to Leonard now. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Cynthia, for an absolutely wonderful talk and a real tour de force in answering the questions. So I guess that brings us to the end of the two very intense days. We've tried to do our best using the virtual environment, and we certainly hope that we've selected topics that were interesting and that were relevant to you. I think Jeff has another informational slide which he's going to post. Just gives you some of the information on follow-up to the course, how to submit your evaluations, and where to find the YouTube recordings. So, of course, we recognize that nothing can really replace the face-to-face experiences we've had in the past. And as much as we've enjoyed hosting you online, we very much hope to see you in person at our next course planned for next year, and we will notify you by email of the details. Please remember to claim your medical credits and provide us feedback so we can ensure that we address your needs in the future. So firstly, I want to thank all the many individuals who made this update possible. Brenda Stoddard and her excellent team in the Office of Small Business and Industry Assistance, Jeff Kelly and his assistants for all our tech support, Millie Duggal in my office for helping our organization, our wonderful speakers, and most important of all, our audience all over the world. Thank you all for your attendance. Go well and stay safe.